On my 22nd birthday, my Uncle Scott discovered my diary. After he found out about my secret love for him, he sent me overseas. He then spent hundreds of thousands marrying the love of his life. In the airport, my Uncle Scott Miller warned me with a cold tone, "Don't ever harbor feelings you shouldn't have." When I came back to the country with a little child in my arms later, he was shocked. "Yours?" I nodded with a smile. "Yeah." About a month after I gave birth, I was in an airplane. I was still feeling a little spaced out. I never thought I would have had the chance to return home after staying overseas for 5 years. Scott had told me to never appear in front of him ever again. However, he was also the one who had personally bought me the air ticket. We finally landed after transiting twice, just so I could come back to join his and Bethany White's wedding anniversary. When we were on the plane, Alana had been sleeping soundly, but the moment got off the plane, she started throwing a tantrum. "Mommy, my feet hurt." When I heard Alana sobbing quietly, I quickly picked her up and walked over to the exit. Once I was at the exit, I pulled out my phone and was going to get a cab. However, it started to ring as soon as I pulled it out. I looked at the string of familiar numbers that appeared on my screen, and I wasn't sure if I should pick it up. In the end, I decided not to. However, the second call quickly came in. I let out a sigh and picked it up. Scott's voice came from the other side instantly. Despite not speaking with him for a few years, I found his voice hadn't changed at all. "You're out of immigration? I've arranged for my personal assistant, Robin, to pick you up." When Scott said those words, he sounded like he was conducting business. It was as if he was trying to avoid sounding familiar with me. I let out a bitter smile. "I can get a cab." There was a short moment of silence. Scott probably didn't expect me to say that. He had taken extremely good care of me for a few years in the past, with people taking care of my every need. I never needed to take a cab. After a brief pause, Scott calmly said, "I think it's better for Robin to come over. I've bought you something to use as a gift for your Aunt Bethany. You'll find it in the trunk. When you're over for a meal, you can take the gift with you." Scott was still as considerate as ever. He had even thought about the gift already. It wasn't out of my imagination, though. He had spent hundreds of thousands just to decorate the wedding venue, as well as going to an auction to bid on a rare diamond, just so he could commission a unique wedding ring for Bethany. I could tell he was in love with her. "I understand," I answered in a low voice as I massaged my forehead. Scott stopped talking, but he didn't hang up either. After a long pause, Scott finally said something again. "Quinn, I hope you've really learned your lesson after spending 5 years overseas. If you do anything to Bethany, you'll be sorry." I was stunned when I heard those words. All the white noise around me seemed to have disappeared. Scott had just told me that I would be sorry. Before I could say anything, he had already hung up. To be honest, Scott didn't have to worry. I wouldn't do anything to them. I simply wanted to raise Alana and find a job. When I left the airport, I lowered my head. When I was 22 years old, I never would have thought my life would take such a turn for the worse. It was on my 22nd birthday that Scott forced me to go overseas that he found my diary. When I was young, something happened to the yacht that my parents were on and never came back. Scott took care of me after that. We had a pretty good relationship. When I became an adult, I realized I wasn't treating Scott as just my uncle. I loved him, but I knew very well that we would have no future. That was why I wrote all my thoughts into the diary. If Scott never found my diary, I would most likely still pretend that my love for him was familial in nature. It was a niece's love for his uncle. However, when Scott saw it, he tore my diary into pieces. How can you have such disgusting thoughts? You know I'm your uncle, right? Your mother's younger brother? Even if we're not blood related, the most we can ever be is uncle and niece. Scott, who had always been a gentleman, was no longer tender to me. He roared at me with disgust in his eyes.